C'est dans ces anges mon idée, j'ai où le loup le nard chanté. C'est dans ces anges mon idée, j'ai où le loup le nard chanté. J'ai où le loup le nard le lièvre, j'ai où le loup le nard chanté. C'est moi-même qui les ai rechignés, j'ai où le loup le nard le lièvre. C'est moi-même qui les ai rechignés, j'ai où le loup le nard chanté. C'est dans ces anges mon idée, j'ai où le loup le nard chanté. C'est dans ces anges mon idée, j'ai où le loup le nard chanté. J'ai où le loup le nard le lièvre, j'ai où le loup le nard chanté. C'est moi-même qui les ai rechignés, j'ai où le loup le nard le lièvre. C'est moi-même qui les ai rechignés, j'ai où le loup le nard chanté. C'est dans quatre ans je m'en irai, j'ai où le loup le nard chanté. C'est dans quatre ans je m'en irai, j'ai où le loup le nard chanté. J'ai où le loup le nard le lièvre, j'ai où le loup le nard chanté. C'est moi-même qui les ai rechignés, j'ai où le loup le nard le lièvre. C'est moi-même qui les ai rechignés, j'ai où le loup le nard chanté.
Hello everyone, thanks for joining me on this week's 172nd Air Wing video. Today we have for review the first Mirage I have brought to the channel. This is going to be the first in a series of videos on the Dassault Mirage series of tactical aircraft. Of course, these will be modeled in 1/72nd scale. This one happens to be from PremiumX models and is sold, at least in this iteration, directly from Dassault's website. I'll have to say, it's a little bit cool to hop onto a major weapons contractor's website and order a model of a tactical fighter aircraft from the people who built the darn thing. There's something to be said for being able to do that, and I wish more companies took Dassault's lead in that regard. So again, this is a 1/72nd scale die-cast model from PremiumX, sold through and branded by Dassault Avion Dassault Mirage of France. So this is straight from the company that built the thing, and I'll be the first to say that as an American collector, I was pretty surprised by the history of the Mirage F1. I'll have to say that one of the perks of doing these videos for y'all is I learned something too doing it. I love being able to share this information with y'all because it brings depth and human meaning to the stories behind these aircraft. Of course, obviously these are 1/72nd scale models, but the story of the tactical aircraft in question involves thousands of people, designers, engineers, developers, project managers, technicians, people on the ground changing the weapons and the bombs and maintaining them, the pilots, of course, and the crews that operate them, and the troops that they've supported and the operations that they've done. And those stories I try to capture on this channel with a brief of the history of the aircraft in question. So after that, we will get to the model details and what I think of the PremiumX iteration here and whether it's worth your 50 odd euros to acquire. So the first thing to start with is the Mirage F1 has a much deeper history than even I appreciated. I knew peripherally that Iraq had used them in the Iran-Iraq war, and in fact the Mirage F1 was a major turning point technically for the Iraqi Air Force at the time, because the fleet of Soviet bloc airplanes that they had simply weren't getting the job done and denied the advanced versions of the MiG-23 that the Iraqis needed to counter the Iranian fleet of American, at the time, leading edge technology such as the F-4E and the F-14 Tomcat, among other American-based aircraft. The Iraqi regime of Saddam Hussein had their backs to the wall on trying to get latest and greatest technology. So they couldn't get weapons from the Soviet Union. They could effectively counter the Iranian force, so they went and purchased the Dassault Mirage F1, which at the time was the latest multi-role fighter that French technology possessed. And it drew the technological tables closer together, and in the Mirage F1 EQ's first outing, it happened to take down an Iranian F-14, which had at that point ruled the skies over the Iran-Iraq battle lines. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. Let's start with the beginning history of the Mirage F1. So the Mirage F1 first took to the air in December 1966, and it was built from a requirement that was issued from the French Air Force, or the Armée de l'Air. And now it's called the Armée de l'Air et Espace, but at the time it was just the Armée de l'Air. And the Armée de l'Air had issued a new requirement for essentially a multi-role tactical fighter that was simple in nature to design and operate. At the time, Dassault was producing various prototypes, such as the Mirage G, which had the variable geometry wings, which is very in vogue at the time of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And the reason for the variable geometry being a popular option is because at the time, fly-by-wire technology was not a thing. So aviation designers all over the world at this point in history were trying to make an aircraft which could do two things. An aircraft which could travel to speeds of beyond Mach 1 to Mach 2 for high-speed interception, and have the ability to be operated from remote air bases. And this is where we come to the Mirage F1's raison d'etre, because the Mirage 3, which was a very capable, adaptable interceptor, which was later used for air superiority and even ground attack, had an Achilles heel, and that was the nature of its delta wing. You see, this Mirage F1 uses a relatively conventional variable camber wing with a conventional tailplane and all-moving stabilator in the back, as well as the ever-present pair of horizontal strakes here and here. Those added after a unfortunately tragic accident involving a flutter, the disassembly of the aircraft, the prototype, which tragically led to the loss of Admiral Marcel Dassault's flight test pilot at the time. But this design layout was a departure from the Mirage 3's delta wing, and the reason for this was the Mirage 3 featured a very high speed, very good turn capability for an aircraft of its time. However, the delta wing meant that the runways it needed to use were fairly long, and not only did it need long runways for takeoff, but it also needed them for landing because of the delta wing's inherent capability and need for a high landing speed. This resulted in a situation where the delta wing Mirage 3 was at a disadvantage, because in the event of a war between the Warsaw Pact / Soviet Union and the forces of the NATO countries, which France would, of course, while at the time not part of NATO, would have sided with the other European nations against a Russian invasion. Had that particular war that so many people thought was inevitable taken place, the Mirage 3s would have been at a disadvantage because they would have needed massive runways. And the first thing that either side was going to do in the event of an all-out war, nuclear or conventional, was for each side to take out the other's runways. So this requirement for short field capability became a universal standard among tactical fighter aircraft designed in that era. And unfortunately, the Delta Wing was simply not capable of enforcing that requirement at the time. The evolution of fly-by-wire technology would change this, and that would, of course, partially result in a return to the Delta Wing design in the replacement for the Mirage F1, which is the Mirage 2000. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll cover the Mirage 2000 at a later video. So returning to the Mirage F1, to solve the problem of short field capabilities while still retaining the maneuverability and interceptor capability of the Mirage 3, the engineers at Dassault went to work and created the Mirage F1 design. So they started with the prototype Mirage G8, which featured, again, the variable geometry wings, which is where the wings move backwards and forwards based on various flight parameters. And it's something we see, of course, in the popular F-14 Tomcat and the Panavia Tornado, among other aircraft at the time. The complexity in engineering and maintenance of the Mirage G8 did not appeal to the Armee de l'Air leadership, and so the Mirage G8 was redesigned. The variable geometry wings were removed, and instead this, again, variable camber wing was installed. In the front were flaps, which are modeled on this aircraft. So you have leading edge flaps and you have trailing edge flaps as well, so that even at speeds as low as 150 knots and lower, I think the touchdown speed is 133 if I remember the publications, the Mirage F1 is very controllable at low air speeds, which is, of course, a gift in terms of being able to operate it from improvised and unimproved areas, as was expected in the event of a Cold War situation. This would, of course, serve the Mirage F1, I should say, very well in its deployments to Africa over the decades ahead of its retirement in 2014. So the Mirage F1 also featured a Mach 2 variable inlet right here, which is reminiscent of what we would see on a Lockheed Martin F-104 Starfighter. The intake cone here would move in and out based on the airspeed, so the Mirage F1 lost nothing for interceptor capability relative to its Delta Wing predecessor. So as you see here, the Mirage F1 features air brakes underneath the intakes on both sides of the fuselage, and it has, in this model iteration, a centerline fuel tank with two Matra Magic infrared guided missiles. So those are essentially the French answer to the AIM-9 Sidewinder and the R-60 and R-73 air-to-air missiles, and that they are all, of course, infrared guided. So the Mirage F1 was accepted for Armee de l'Air service in 1973, and it wasn't long before the Mirage F1 would be used in combat. Its first deployment was in Africa in an effort in the 1970s and 1980s to oppose a Libyan-backed militia, which was trying to overthrow the government of Chad. This effort eventually culminated in a tactical strike by a series of Armée de l'Air Mirage F1s, which were used to bomb an airfield in Chad to, again, halt the Libyan support for the Chadian guerrilla forces. As much as the Armée de l'Air did make multiple contributions to that fight, including several close air support missions, eventually the effort had to be abandoned when the French withdrew from Chad, or I should say the Chadian theater, when the government was eventually overthrown in the early 1990s. Now, the Mirage F1 would go on to serve with a lot of air forces. It served with the Greece, the Hellenic Air Force, Ecuador's Air Force, Iraq, as previously mentioned, Jordan, Kuwait, Libya, and South Africa, as well as eventually Iran. And let us not forget, of course, Spain also had them as well. So Iran wound up with a fleet of Mirage F1s because while they weren't the initial customer for the aircraft, the Mirage F1 was used by neighboring Iraq. And due to, let's just call it like it is, due to piss poor leadership on the part of the Iraqi command and control, 8 Mirage F1s were shot down over the Persian Gulf War in 1991 with no kills claimed by the Iraqi side. So as an example, I suppose, of what skill means in terms of aircraft capability, the Iraqis' counterparts in Libya happen to fare a bit better. With the Mirage F1, a curious situation happened in the initial deployment that I mentioned earlier, and it would be something that would happen almost routinely with the Mirage F1, and it's that the aircraft found itself on both sides of the conflict. So in the Chadian intervention in the 1980s, the French deployed Mirage F1s as escorts, and the Libyans themselves deployed Mirage F1s as strike aircraft. Neither of them crossed paths in the air. I believe, based on Tom Cooper's publications, the goal of the Armee del Air was to avoid a direct confrontation with Libya. It didn't look like it was a politically wise idea to do that, so Armee del Air Mirages did not tangle with Libyan equivalents. However, the Libyan Mirages would tangle with U.S. Navy F-14s, and this is where we get to an interesting piece of 1980s history. Before the Gulf of Sidra happened, before the Gulf of Sidra incident, I should say, happened, there had been multiple instances where, in line with Muammar Gaddafi's proclamation of the line of death in the Gulf of Sidra and claiming territory in the ocean, which was considered international waters, the U.S. Navy would conduct operations to secure freedom of navigation. So among those efforts, the deployed squadrons with the U.S. Navy would fly F-14s over the airspace of international waters, and Libyan Mirages would sometimes be scrambled to intercept. And it's interesting that the pilots who flew those missions made the observation that while Libyan pilots of MiG-23s were not terribly they were not considered necessarily skilled, which is understandable because the MiG-23 is a very difficult airplane to proficiently fly. But the Mirages and the people flying them were considered a higher caliber of opponent by U.S. Navy pilots who engaged them over the waters near Libya. Now, no shots were fired between F-14s and the Mirage F-1s in this situation, and it looks like, again, based off of Tom Cooper's publications on Libyan air operations, it's pretty clear that most of the Libyan pilots knew better than to pull the trigger on a U.S. Navy aircraft. Basically, both sides used it as an opportunity for, let's just say, real-time training, let's say. Each side used the other for BFM practice, for basic fighter maneuvers practice, and then the Libyans would fly back home, and that was that. There's a really good article about a MiG-23 MLD fighting a Tomcat in one of these situations, but suffice it to say that a couple of the Libyan pilots didn't clearly understand what they were working with, especially when they fired their R-60s head-on, when the R-60 was not a front quarter capable missile, and they got themselves shot down accordingly over it. So by the looks of things, most of the Libyan pilots knew better than to push their luck. So such was the case with the Mirage F1s. Again, they didn't pull the trigger on any Tomcats, nor the other way around, but apparently they had quite a few fights together. So this pattern would continue because the Mirage F1 would serve on both sides in the Persian Gulf. One of the reasons why they didn't necessarily have the best combat record in that war is because, of course, the Iraqis seemed to be in a hurry to get as many of theirs shot down as possible, and the French Air Force deployed a contingent to participate as part of that operation. However, due to justified concerns with fratricide and having a French Armee de l'Air F-1 be mistaken for an Iraqi enemy aircraft. They were kept out of the theater deliberately and off of the air tasking order to be used as rear echelon air defense for the Qatari Air Force and the Kuwaitis. So once the initial phase of Desert Storm was operational, the Mirage F1s were retasked to, again, strike escort and air-to-ground operations, with most of the Iraqi Air Force either destroyed or on its way to permanent impoundment in Iran. The Mirage F1s were used again for multiple air-to-ground operations in that theater. And this by no means was the end of the Mirage F1's career. The Mirage F1 went on to be used in Operation Allied Force in 1999. It would serve in Kosovo, dropping bombs on Serb positions, once again doing strikes and close air support missions as per the NATO air tasking order. And it would go back to Africa again in a later counterinsurgency operation, Operation Barkhane, this time against forces of Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab in Africa. And last but not least, we would be remiss to omit the Mirage F1's contribution to Afghanistan when they were deployed once again in a counterinsurgency close air support role to Kandahar Air Base in 2007. So this is a good opportunity to point out here that as a veteran, I find it a bit upsetting to see memes floating around about the French being called surrender monkeys, because for all intents and purposes, that's basically bullshit. If you actually have any understanding of how the French military has contributed to the war on terror and fighting counterinsurgencies over the years, informed people know better. And in multiple respects, the French were actually ahead of the curve on this whole counterinsurgency war on terror business. One aspect to point out is when the Operation El Dorado Canyon was in the planning stages, initially the State Department sought permission for the strike force of F-111s leaving the United Kingdom to fly over France to strike the targets in Libya. And usually, especially in the 1980s, this would not have been a problem to get approval for. However, the controversy there was the French felt that the Operation El Dorado Canyon didn't hit enough targets. The French actually wanted the United States Air Force to do more damage than what was originally planned. And the plan was multiple military facilities, air bases, and barracks buildings would be hit and targeted by the strike force of F-111s, which, let it be known, is at the time one of the largest payload strike bombers of its era. So already what was on the table wasn't, it wasn't the UN non-binding resolution letter as it was, but the French wanted even more firepower brought to that. And when Reagan apparently vetoed that option, the French closed their airspace to the strike group, which of course led to Operation El Dorado Canyon and the F-111s and tankers participating in it turning into the longest range strike mission ever flown. As far as I understand, that record still stands even today. So the closure of French airspace of that attack outfit meant that they had to fly around the peninsula of Spain and through the Mediterranean, which of course added thousands of miles to the trip. So let that be the sign that the French are not ones to shy away from a fight, and their contribution to the global war on terror and suppressing radical fundamentalist terrorism elements is something to be recognized. And I'll just make that point right now because, again, those people who are spewing nonsense about the French military being weak sauce, put simply, they don't know what the fuck they're talking about. So on that note, the Mirage F1 service came to a conclusion in 2014 when, after the adoption of the Dassault Rafale, the F1 was finally retired, and many of the squadrons were either closed down or converted to the Rafale, which between the Rafale and the Mirage 2000 took over many of the Mirage F1's duties. But the Mirage F1 story is not done, because interestingly enough, the Mirage F1 is being used even now as I make this video by ATAC Corporation. ATAC is an aggressor corporation based in the United States, and they fly adversary aircraft for training because it's more affordable for a private company to do that than the US military to fund that mission in-house. And they have a fleet of about 80 Mirage F1s, which were purchased from the Armee de l'Air as well as the Royal Jordanian Air Force. And these Mirage F1s, I believe out of the whole fleet, 40 of them have been modernized and updated and readied for aggressor operations, and they are used for that mission to this day, which I think is an absolutely splendid use of these aircraft. They are capable enough technologically to still represent a lot of the third generation and early fourth generation threats out in the world. There are still countries like Iran that operate the Mirage F1, so there is definitely tactical rationale for keeping these available for training purposes, and they're safe, they're affordable to fly, and there's a lot of them, so there's a deep level of logistical support that can be devoted to operating them, and they're very high performance. Again, you're looking at a Mirage 3, which has, Mirage 3 level of performance. So you're looking at Mach 2, 12 degrees or so a second turn rate at optimum corner airspeed. And, you're looking at, a very capable aircraft that can simulate a wide variety of threats and do a really good job of emulating third and fourth generation assets. So it's a good choice to use for the aggressor mission. And I suspect the Mirage F1 story is not concluded even almost 50 years after it first flew in the mid-1960s. So it really says something about the durability of a French tactical fighter design that it's still being used to this day in that capacity, going up against fourth and fifth generation stealth assets. So incidentally, the air forces of, again, Iran and South Africa used them. In South African service, the Mirage F1 did go up against the MiG-23 flown by Cuban Air Force pilots who were helping the Angolans. And in this instance, a Mirage F1 from the South African Air Force was hit and damaged. The pilot made an emergency landing, and while the aircraft apparently landed more or less intact, the pilot didn't come out of it quite as well. It's worth pointing out here that while we live in the modern era of 0-0 ejection seats, in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, this really wasn't the case. And the earlier ejection seats that came on the Mirage F1 required a minimum horizontal airspeed, and the pilot who crashed that aircraft, unfortunately, was not in that parameters and paid the price. So, the Mirage F1 has a really deep history, and it's interesting looking at it how the French have adapted this interceptor to be a multi-role aircraft despite having just one engine, and is a fraction of the size of something like a F-111 or a McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II. And of course, it's absolutely dwarfed by a F-14 Tomcat or an F-15E Strike Eagle. So really good design. It speaks well for the folks at Avion Marcel Dassault that they've built something like this, and I'm glad to have this one in my collection. So on that note, we'll pivot to the PremiumX iteration of the Mirage F1 and what it comes with. So the first thing to understand is this sold. I'm not sure what the prices will be when you watch this now, but the time of this video, these are selling for about 50 euros. So for the price, it's very reasonable. You're getting something that does come really well out of the box for about anywhere from 25% to half price of something like a Panzerkampf or a Mirage from a Hobbymaster. And in this case, with the Mirage F1, there's no real competition because, as far as I can tell, PremiumX are the only people that make a 1/72nd scale die-cast Mirage F1. So if it's the F1 you specifically want, this is your only game in town. And for the price, again, for 50 euros, it's pretty good. I ordered mine directly, again, from Dassault, from France, so it had to come quite a ways, and that's something I will get into more when we get to the pros and cons section of it. But as far as form and accuracy goes, it looks pretty much right on to the real thing, which is what you would expect from a model that comes directly from the company that built these. Be advised that the marks here, showing the registration number of the aircraft, the accent on the intake, that red accent there, as well as the tail flash for the Squadron. All of those elements are decals that come in the box. So what you get in the PremiumX kit is, of course, the aircraft itself, the pieces that you can use to display it with the landing gear down or up, which you see right now. Of course, it's in the up position, so you'll have the landing gear doors that go there and then go underneath there. And you have the refueling probe, which is right here. And it's not attached to the model as it comes out of the box. You can glue it on yourself, which is what I've done here. This is because the Mirage F1C, some variants of the Mirage F1, like the Mirage F1A, did not have the refueling probe. Some did. So depending on the squadron and the time period that you want to display it with, you have the option of including it or not, which is a nice touch. Do note, of course, that the length of the airplane is different whether it has the fuel probe or not, because the ones with the fuel probe are about 10 inches longer. But again, you don't get two different lengths of models with this. So just bear in mind that if you're a stickler for accuracy, yes, technically it's not the same exact airplane, but for all intents and purposes, unless you want to break out a Dremel and put a fuselage plug to 1/72nd scale size to add 10 inches to the airplane to accurately model that, which I think is just going way too far. But you just glue it on. If you want to have it with the refueling probe, you can just put a little glue on the bottom, put it on the nose right there, and you're in business. So you have the option, of course, displaying it with or without. And the decals, I will say right now, the decals, especially for the Foxtrot Delta registration there of the aircraft, those were a pain to put on. The other ones, like the intake ones and the 30, as well as the tail flash, all of those are relatively simple, straightforward to install, but the letters here on the decal kit are individual. So you have to cut each one out individually and, push it off of the decal pad with the Q-tip individually and line it up individually. So if you're looking at this and thinking, hey, well, the D looks a little off from the F, yeah, you're not wrong. But I put the decal on and then it slipped just a little bit. And that was as close as I could get them to being lined up without causing damage to the decal. And you only get one set. So if I ruined the FD, then I would basically be up a creek because I've already done all this work here. And it wouldn't be accurate if I ruined that letter. So I left it where it is, which for all intents and purposes, it looks good. Remember, this is a 50 euro model. So if you're looking for the level of customizableness, whatever, you know what I'm saying. If you're looking for the level of equipment capability that you would get in something like a $150 Hobbymaster or $110 Panzerkampf, you're not going to get that here. You're basically going to get, again, the aforementioned centerline fuel tank, 2 Matra infrared missiles, and that's it. That's all you're getting. So it is 50 euros. So as far as it being a con that it doesn't have like 2 Matra 530s or like a wing Matra 530 or a centerline Matra 530 radar guided missile or external fuel tanks on the wing pylons or any of those types of things, it's up to you if that's a deal breaker or not. But personally, it's not. I mean, for 50 euros, some costs have to be cut, and all things considered, what you see here is a perfectly viable interceptor configuration. So again, I would have liked to see a Matra 530 missile on the bottom, which was an equipment fit that could be done on the Mirage F1s, but I'm not so bent out of shape about that I'm going to, really harp on that point. Remember, this is a 50 euro model, so again, the expectation here should not be getting something that costs 50 euros but delivers 120 euros of quality. That would be awesome, but That's just not what's on the table here, and we really shouldn't hold that against Dassault and PremiumX because of what they're billing. The cockpit is not removable. This is fixed, but it is accurately detailed, and you do get a heads-up display, a little green plastic piece there to simulate the heads-up display, which is really good. I wish they had done that with the Altea Super Étendard because it's just naked inside of that cockpit, but I digress. Speaking of the cockpit, also, you do get a pilot figure. That pilot figure is non-removable. I suppose if you take a hobby knife and slide it in between the body of the model and the canopy bow, you could probably take it off, but frankly, I don't see the point. It looks quite nice the way it is. And yeah, I'm going to say it again, it's a €50 model. I mean, what level of quality do you want to see in something like this? So, for what you get, for what you're paying, it's pretty darn good. To pay 25 to 40% of what you would spend on a Hobby Master if they made a Mirage F1 model, which they don't, but if they did, it would probably cost at least $100, and this is easily half of that. So, €50, €60 with shipping. For what you get, it's rather reasonable. I would have liked to see some more detail with the engine because it's just basically a silver blocking plate back there with no afterburner or any kind of detail there. And I know they can do that because the PremiumX Mirage 2000 has that detail and it's done really well. So it's interesting that the Mirage 2000 from the same company by the same vendor has engine detail, but the Mirage F1 does not. I would have liked to have seen that here. And clearly they can do it for the price point because they're selling Mirage 2000s with the Snegma ATAR engine detail modeled well, and they're doing it for 60 something euros. So I don't think modeling the engine accurately is going to drive up the price very much. So something to understand for later releases. And so in terms of the pros of the model, I think it's a really good representation of the Mirage F1. You do get a very comprehensive list of available decals that you can use to make whatever squadron from the French Air Force that suits your fancy. So understand you are going to get just the decals and the paint scheme of a French Air Force Mirage F1. You're not going to get, say, the Royal Jordanian or the Iraqi Air Force look unless you happen to have a set of decals for those aircraft, and the Mirage F1s they flew happen to match the Armee Del Air color scheme that you see here. So if you have that, then by all means knock yourself out, use those decals instead. But as it comes out of the box, it is strictly Armee Del Air squadrons. So I chose the, and if I get the pronunciation wrong, please be gentle. I'm doing my best here. It's been about 15 or so years since I spoke French on a regular basis. So I chose the name Champagne based Lorraine Squadron 330, once again based on name Champagne. And I chose that squadron because they were the original Tiger Squadron for the Mirage F1. Would have been nice to see my Tiger Squadron decals in there, but maybe that's something you're penciling in for another release. Be that as it may, I did pick that squadron because of their history with the NATO Tiger Group. And even though there's no Tiger Squadron color scheme, they did have a really cool tail flash there, so that's why I chose that decal. So when you get it out of the box, none of this stuff is going to be here. It's basically just going to be the naked blue model with generic trim. You do see like the crew egress and some of the warning as well as the roundels here and here. That stuff is that's all painted to the model, it's all tampoed, but the tail flash here again and the front registration are decals, as well as the accents for the engine. So in terms of pros, it's very simple to get. You go to Dassault.com and you pick it out, you buy it, and you go. 50 euros, pretty darn efficient. The folks at Dassault know their business. They turned around the order in about a week, and it got to my house in the United States in about 2.5 weeks. So from the seller processing perspective, it was a good deal, and I'm glad to have ordered it from Dassault. Again, it's kind of cool to just order a model of a company's airplane from the company that built it. For 50 euros, you do get quite a bit here. And incidentally, this is the only Mirage F1 diecast model that you can actually buy. So I believe periodically you can pick up a Falcon Models version, but those sell for literally $200+ a pop if and when they come up. So I would not recommend going down that course, because as somebody who does own a Falcon model of a Kafir, this is pretty similar in quality to that. So I would not pay $200 for one of these, which incidentally I've seen some earlier PremiumX Mirages going for $200 on eBay too. So that's yeah, no, I would not spend that on this. 50 euros though, done deal, great deal. If you can get it for that from Dassault directly, do it. The drawbacks, it's not necessarily as detailed as you might see on something that costs $100 or $150. Panel lines are relatively bare bones. You basically just get the bare minimum in terms of modeled control surfaces. The flaps and the spoilers on the wing are modeled. The leading edge slats / flaps are modeled, as well as some of the doors and panel actuators, you know, so forth down here. However, that's pretty much it. So there's no detail on the nose. There's no panel line detail here on the bottom. There's no panel line detail on the ventral side of the airplane. And you just have the rudder detail here. So again, 50 euros, very bare bones. Would have been nice to see a little bit more, and I would pay, you know, $65, $70 if it had a Panzerkampf or Hobbymaster level of panel line detail, but we don't get that here. So again, for the money, it's a good balance of detail and you know, relatively simple cost cutting. I mean, I would like to see more detail, but again, for the price, it's really hard to argue with it. So the cons, it did have to come all the way from France. Obviously, France to the US is quite a long, it's a long walk, put it mildly. So when I opened the box to take delivery, stuff was broken. I'm happy to say that the tail here, the horizontal stabilizer, was cracked, completely off. I had to re-glue that very carefully. So if you've noticed in the introductory shots that there is a crack in the stabilizer, you are not seeing things, your screen is not broken. The model was damaged in shipping. And unfortunately, that was also true of the Mirage 2000s, which I had to do some remedial work involving some sanding and repainting to fix. Not fun, but the alternative was to box them up and send them back. And at that point, I'm basically back where I started, because guess what Dassault has to do for the replacements? They're gonna have to put them in the box, and they're gonna have to ship it the same way that these came anyway. So I'm just basically setting myself up for waiting an additional 3 to 4 weeks to have the same thing happen to the replacements. I mean, it's just, to me, it wasn't a logical course to send them back to Dassault when it wasn't Dassault's fault. They didn't, you know, they packaged it, but they didn't, you know, actually transport it to my house. A shipping company did that. So the fact that it's broken is not something they really could have helped. And the other point is, again, what's to stop the same thing from happening to the replacements that I get on exchange? So I mentioned that because I did have the skill, of course, to fix it and get the Mirage F1 here more or less shipshape. The missiles that come off of the airplane, this was cracked, and the interior mouse fur lining of the tray that you get in the box was cracked as all get out. So yeah, it wasn't a good time opening the box and seeing broken parts rattling around, to tell you that. So you know, if you're ever going to get one of these and you're not local to France or to Europe, just bear in mind that you might want to keep some glue and some sanding sticks ready, and some model putty on hand, because you might be doing some work. And I'm not saying that to scare you off of buying it, because again, $50 plus $10 for shipping, 50 euros, $50. At this point, the exchange rate's very similar, so we can use them interchangeably. But at this juncture, there's, you know, just bear in mind that you might have to do some remedial work to fix them if you do long distance shipping, because there might be some damage. Hopefully it doesn't happen to you. Hopefully I was just the unlucky one out of, you know, 10 million or 2 million or 10,000 or whatever number of people who just had their box put on the wrong flight, but you know, or whatever, and something got dropped. But yeah, it was not a good time opening the box and seeing stuff rattling around. and having to take action to fix it. But I was able to correct the situation. So I fixed the horizontal stabilizer. I also fixed the ventral fin here and the loose missiles, and that was it. So all things considered, all's well that ends well. Again, I don't have any problem with Dassault or how they did the order. They don't have any power over the shipping company once it leaves their dock and it's on their vehicle. So between Reims, France, and where I live in the United States, all kinds of things could have happened to the box that caused that damage. So rather again than risk having that happen again to the exchange ones, I just fixed the ones I got. So bear in mind, that's one of the reasons why you like dealing with local vendors, because if they see that sort of thing, they will just keep that stuff off of their shelf, and you as a customer won't even know that they had issues with the shipment. You'll just buy a model that's perfectly sorted from the beginning. So just bear in mind when you do order it directly from Dassault, that's a risk that you have to keep in mind. Another point is availability. So I was able to go on Dassault's website and just order this directly. However, as I understand it, Dassault does not necessarily have a restocking schedule. So it's one of those deals where it's first come, first serve. If you go to Dassault's website and it's available, pick it up, order it, click the buy button and do your thing. But if you see it's not available, I don't know what to tell you, because they don't publish a schedule and they just kind of pop up when they pop up. So I was tipped to this by a foreign member on Model Hangar 3, and I then clicked the link, jumped on the site, and I was like, oh wow, these are like €50. I can totally afford this, and made spur of the moment purchases of a fleet of Mirages. So yeah, I was able to do that, and thankfully I was in a position to take advantage of it. But bear in mind, if you go to Dassault's website and you can't find it or they're sold out, you basically just have to bookmark it, check it periodically, and see when new releases come up. So they don't really seem to have a published schedule, it just happens. So if you're in that period where you're in between releases, these get very hard to find quickly. I think I saw one of these selling again for like $200 something, one of the earlier ones that Dassault released some years back. So don't pay that. Don't pay $200 for this. Sit it out, set a calendar or reminder or whatever you like to do for managing your time, and just check the website periodically. When they come up, get them for €50 and enjoy. That would be my advice. So the third con, and this is again not something I would say it's a problem, but you don't get a lot of weaponry with this. It's not like Panzercam for Hobbymaster, where you get a box full of missiles and fuel tanks and targeting pods and the like. It's just, here's the airplane, here's a couple of Matra missiles, here's a centerline fuel tank, there you go. That's it. Your options consist of including or excluding the refueling probe. So if you're the type of person that likes to display your models with every bomb ever made hanging off the rail, or somebody who wants to have a radar-guided Matra 530 on your aircraft, this is not going to work out for you. I suppose if you got a 1/72nd scale Matra 530 and you fabricated a pylon and bolted it to the bottom here, or glued it or whatever to the bottom, you probably have something that will look pretty darn nice. And I may do that at some point in the future. But at the moment, just bear in mind, out of the box, you are not going to get a comprehensive list of weapons. And finally, the landing gear. As a pro, you do have the option of displaying it gear down or gear up, which is nice at this price point. However, the landing gear legs are a little bit fidgety. You will want to put some blue tack down to make sure they don't move too much when you have it on display. Otherwise, it can get a little wobbly. But again, for the price point, we really can't, sit here and criticize it too much. For €50, you're getting quite a bit of model for your money. So with that, I will endorse a recommendation to add this Mirage F1 to your collection if you do like the aircraft. If you don't, and you're just tuning in to check out the latest video, I'll extend my thanks to the subscribers now up to 445, which is awesome. So thank you all for the support. I will certainly keep making videos as long as my collection holds out. So at some point in the distant future, I may have to give a sad face message because I'm out of models to review and I don't have infinite finances or storage space to buy new ones to keep making videos. So at some point between now and the imminent galactic collision of the Milky Way and the Andromeda galaxies, I'll have to give a video to the effect of, hey, that's That's all, folks, Bugs Money style, because I've purchased everything that I can afford to have and stand in my collection, but we're not there yet. And thankfully, I'm glad to say we won't be there for some time. But if this isn't necessarily your ideal aircraft model, don't worry. I've got several other ones on the channel that you might be interested in. So I've got everything in my collection from F4s to MiGs to stealth fighters to 5th generation F-22 and F-35, MiG-23s. So I'm looking at getting, of course, a series of Mirages next on the channel. So those of you that are French air power fans, definitely stay tuned. I may get a Super Étendard on here as well. We'll see what the coming weeks bring in. And I've got some other pre-orders that are supposedly shipping in the month of April at the time of this video. So I'll be getting those on the channel as well. And those of you that are Phantom fans, keep an eye out for May. I've got some plans for that month as well. So if you're Vietnam era F4 fans, like I said, bookmark this site, consider subscribing. Actually, there is no bookmarking in YouTube now that I think of it, but the closest thing to that would be just subscribing. That way you'll be notified when I release a new video. So again, if you're a Phantom fan, keep your eyes peeled for May. I've got some plans in store for that month. And those of you that are French Mirage fans or just fans of airplanes in general, stay tuned. I generally try to upload a video once every Sunday. A Sunday morning at 6 in the morning, and those of you who are subscribed will get a notification in your notification menu in YouTube, and you can click that and see the latest review. So with that, we will leave the video here. Thank you all for your time and watching the video, and we will catch you in next week's release.